they have not released a name pending notification of next of kin. Now, to bring you up to date, apparently an electrician was inside the Kurt Cobain home this morning at approximately 8:30 when that electrician discovered the body of a white male, apparently in his late 20s. The man had been shot to death, apparently a self-inflicted wound from a gunshot. Police found a one-page suicide note next to the body, also some form of ID.
I believe that it very likely was a homicide, not a suicide, because the amount of heroin that was found in him would have been enough to kill 3-4 people. Yet they have him injecting himself and then cleaning off the syringe and the needle and putting it back neatly into his own private little brown leather control box, and then taking the shotgun and shooting himself. Bullshit.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am the American SpyFox. Welcome to the channel. In today's video, we are going to have a candid interview with world-famous forensic pathologist, Dr. Cyril Wecht. Typically, when I make videos, the very last thing I do is create an introduction. And I have to tell you, a part of the reason, other than me being sick for a couple days, that this video has taken so long to come out is to introduce a person like Dr. Cyril Wecht is an overwhelmingly daunting task. How do you wrap up, how do you explain in one tight little package everything that this guy has done, everything he has contributed to forensic science? His career spans 7 decades. It begins with the review of the assassination of JFK all the way up until present day. He is still teaching as a college professor. He still runs a consultation office where he reviews autopsies and the remains of mysterious deaths. Most recently, one of the most high-profile deaths of our generation, Jeffrey Epstein. Dr. Wecht reviewed the autopsy and remains of Jeffrey Epstein, which we will be talking about in a different video. His career is just too much to wrap up in one short introduction. I could write an entire series just based off the cases Dr. Wecht has handled. Everything from JFK, Martin Luther King, John Benet Ramsey, Anna Nicole Smith, O.J. Simpson, Marilyn Monroe, Elvis Presley, Kurt Cobain. I mean, so many high-profile cases. I honestly don't know where to begin. And then I started thinking, you know what? 1,000 years from now, school children are going to read about the great man that was JFK and his assassination, just like today we read about Julius Caesar and his assassination. Well, accompanied with those great men, those great leaders of their time, was a great physician who did their autopsy. Matter of fact, the Roman physician Anstisius, who was said to be the personal doctor of Julius Caesar, conducted the very first recorded autopsy in history, and it was done on Julius Caesar's corpse. The interesting thing about this is most people do not remember it for being the very first documented and recorded autopsy, but they remember it for what Anstisius discovered. And what he discovered was only one of the 23 stab wounds inflicted upon Julius Caesar by the jealous Roman senators was fatal. It was a wound underneath the left shoulder blade that would have pierced the heart and/or lung. All the other wounds were superficial. He could have survived. And it is said that the fatal wound came from Caesar's own son, or at least a young man that he thought of as his son, Marcus Brutus. For many years, Marcus Brutus's mother, Servia, had been Caesar's mistress, and he had always treated her son as though he was his own. When Julius Caesar, and Pompey at last came to clash over the power of Rome to determine who would be emperor, Marcus Brutus took the side of Pompey. And even still, Caesar demanded that his troops bring no harm to Marcus Brutus. That if they crossed him in the battlefield, they would not harm him, but just capture him. After Pompey's destruction and Caesar comes to the throne, he carries on this father-son relationship with Marcus Brutus, this unconditional love that only a father could have for a son. It is this young senator, Marcus Brutus, that Caesar loved as a son who inflicted the fatal wound. Thus his last words, et tu, Brute, you too, Brutus, or you too, my boy. And thus we get the analogy when someone goes out of their way to ensure that you don't succeed, when your spouse cheats on you, when a close friend or family member betrays you, we say, they stabbed me in the back. Similarly, Dr. Wecht discovered something very interesting about the evidence of JFK's assassination. And ladies and gentlemen, that was the president's brain was missing. Just gone, vanished. Hey, has anyone seen a brain lying around anywhere? Where's the brain at? No one knows. Just disappeared. Never to be returned, might I add. Along with a lot of other evidence, he uncovers a presidential assassination conspiracy. 1,000 years from now, when school children are reading about JFK, they are also going to read about Dr. Cyril Wecht and his review of the evidence that uncovered a presidential assassination conspiracy. And I thought there's no better way to introduce Dr. Cyril Wecht to the video than to tell a really unique, interesting story about forensic history. A murder in 13th century China. Who was involved and how the medical examiner, the coroner, or as they called themselves then, death investigator, solved the case. This is a man who is going to be written about in history books and will be read about in the future. He will have a significant role to play in the history of forensic science. So, if I asked you to guess right now, think of an answer in your mind, how long ago do you think forensic science first appeared? When did people finally say, hey, we need law and order, crime and punishment. If something happens to a neighbor or a friend, we need to figure out who did it and what happened to them? The answer may shock you. We have been doing it since we were nomadic tribes wandering the earth. After all, as Dr. Wecht explains it, if you wake up in the morning and your neighbor is bludgeoned to death in their hut, you're going to want to examine that scene and figure out who among you did it so you're not waking up tomorrow with a caved-in skull. So forensic science has been around long before science was even a concept or even a word. People in the past had ingenious ways to figure out what happened to a victim. If you're anything like me, you probably think forensic science started in the 1900s sometime, right? And then in the 90s we got into DNA, and that's pretty much what forensics is all about. Hair follicles and nail clippings and blood spatter analysis and bodily fluids from perverts. Throw some nail clippings in a machine and it spins around and spits out a letter sequence that's only identifiable to one human being on Earth. Well, let me tell you what Chi did in the 13th century. I believe he called himself a death investigator at the time, but he would be now what we call a coroner. And Chi wrote a book called The Washing Away of Wrongs. It was a guide for death investigators. What to look for, what to examine, what to analyze, what questions to ask, who to ask these questions to. These were things that were long being recorded and passed down through generations. With the technology of writing, we can now not only learn from our own lifetime experience, we can learn from others' lifetime's experience. This is just one ingenious way that Chi solved a murder within a small farming village in the 13th century. A Chinese physician by the name of Chi writes a guidebook for any medical examiners. They called them the Death Investigations, The Washing Away of Wrongs. Believe it or not, this is a guidebook that contains ideas and thoughts and analysis directions that are still in use to this day. Most ingenious of Chi is a case he investigated in which a resident of a small village had been hacked to death. Very major lacerations all over the body. Since this was a village full of farmers, everyone in the village owned sharp farming tools, so he could not narrow it down. It was not as easy as just saying, who among you has a weapon that could do this? In a small village, sure, if only 1 or 2 or 3 people owned a weapon that could produce those kind of marks, then it'd be very easy to narrow it down, but they all own weapons that could do this. Chi did the most ingenious thing he could have done during his time, and as humans, we adapt to the technology of our time. We cleverly implement the resources we have at our disposal. This is not something that I would have ever have thought to have done. I don't know about you, but it's not a thought that's ever crossed my mind. This is how Song-Chi solved the murder. He has all the villagers bring their farming tools to the center of the village. They're growing things like wheat and rice, so most farmers have sickles, and they are all asked to lay out their tool on the ground in front of them, and Song-Chi waits. Now he knows that whoever the murderer was, they've cleaned their weapon. Any trace evidence that could be seen with the naked eye is gone, but yet Song-Chi still has them bring their tools, lay them out on the ground, and he just sits there and waits. And after a time, to everyone's astonishment, flies begin to collect around one particular sickle in front of one particular villager. Song-Chi is using what he has at his disposal. Would a technique like this prove useful today? Well, no, because we have things like soap and bleach. But remember, in the 13th century, they didn't have bleach. So you could wash it as much as you wanted with water. Those flies are still going to smell the blood and the sinew and the guts and the brains left on your blade, and they're going to be attracted to it. Trace evidence. As the villagers come to understand why Song-Chi has had them place their farming tools on the ground, Song-Chi says nothing as all the villagers' eyes come upon one man and one sickle. Feeling the weight of all eyes on him and feeling the weight of the silence, feeling the guilt, the ridicule from his neighbors, the villager breaks down and confesses to the murder. That's amazing to me. That kind of thought would never occur to any of us today. But again, Song-Chi was using the technology and the resources of his time. He used the fact that there wasn't any such substance that could wash away the smell of that blood. He knew there would still be trace evidence of it. He used the resources he had, the flies, and then he used public shaming to get the person to confess. As Dr. Cyril Wecht has said in many lectures I've watched online, forensic pathology is not always an exact science like DNA. There are many aspects of forensic pathology that have to be interpreted by the right medical examiner. Not all medical examiners are good at their job. As I've heard Dr. Wecht say during a lecture at Waynesburg University, just because someone's been through medical school does not mean they'd make a good medical examiner. And they are especially not the right medical examiner if there is a conflict of interest, such as being friends with the spouse of the person they're examining. The way one medical examiner conducts his office could be totally different from how another medical examiner governs their office, and it's up to the person in that position. Yes, the medical examiner is given that much authority. In ways, they have more power than the DA or the chief of police. If the coroner who examined Kurt Cobain's body was as competent, as astute as Dr. Cyril Wecht, we would not be having this conversation right now. Kurt Cobain's autopsy would have had quite a different outcome. Having said all this, let's get on to the interview. There's a couple things that I would like for you to know. Number one is I was very nervous. This is the first interview I've ever conducted. There were supposed to be interviews in the past with other key players of the Kurt Cobain murder conspiracy. It didn't work out. This one did, and it worked out great. You will hear Dr. Wecht answer a question that I've never heard him answer before, not even in Soaked in Bleach. Because it was my first interview, there were a couple mistakes made. You have to understand that being an inexperienced interviewer and your very first interview is world famous forensic pathologist Dr. Wecht, it was like, there was a lot of pressure. This is a guy I admire. It's a guy I respect. His career is longer than any forensic pathologist that's ever walked the earth. He has been involved in more high profile cases than I can count. He will be read about in the history books. So of course I was a little nervous. There were a couple mistakes made. I will interject in between questions and or answers as to provide more commentary, more context to either why I asked the question I did or why Dr. Wecht answered the way he did for those of you who may be new to the Cobain murder conspiracy case. There's one thing that needs to be known. Dr. Wecht asked me for nothing. This is a man who still teaches in college, still gives lectures, has a consultation agency. This is a busy guy. He gave me a bit of his time. Yes, I was very limited. Yes, it was only a phone conversation. In the future, I hope to have a video conference call, and I will be offering a fee to Dr. Wecht because I understand that expert testimony, expert advice and opinion is worth something. I am shocked that he did this for free. He did not ask me to speak about any books, even though he has authored numerous books. There is a movie being made about his career called Cyril, an independent film. He didn't ask me to push anything for him. He asked for nothing. I owe him greatly, and all I could give him was my gratitude. Now, gratitude isn't worth a whole lot. So what I discern from this is Dr. Wecht cares about the Cobain case. He wants people to know the truth. He is gaining nothing by cooperating with me and giving me his time. He saw someone who was continuing to talk about the Cobain case and trying to keep it out in the public eye, and he said, I want to help. I don't know about you, but I have a lot more respect for the guy knowing what I know now. Ladies and gentlemen, my 15-minute interview with Dr. Cyril Wecht.
Good afternoon, Dr. Wecht's office.
Hello, my name is Charles Elliott. I was calling for Dr. Wecht.
Okay, and I'm sorry, your name is?
Charles Elliott.
Oh, okay. You have a 3 o'clock phone interview with Dr. Wecht?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, one moment.
Yes, hello, this is Dr. Wecht.
Hello, Dr. Wecht. How are you today?
All right, okay, thank you.
All right. Well, I know that we don't have a lot of time, so I wanted to just go ahead and get into it. I have several questions written out. I'll provide statements to provide context, and then if you want to answer, you can. If you don't, you don't. Also, I wanted to thank you very, very much for speaking with me.
Well, I'm pleased to talk with you.
Wow, thank you very much. Okay, let's go number one. And I do edit, so if you wanted to start over or anything, that's completely fine. Dr. Wecht, in your career, you have conducted over 18,000 autopsies and...
21,000.
First question. Wrong. That's right. In my very first interview, I screwed up the statement right off the bat. What happened was I watched an old lecture from a few years ago where Dr. Wecht said he had done over 18,000 autopsies. Assuming he was retired, I stuck with that number. This guy's still going. He's still at it. He's done thousands more since the last time he gave a lecture at Waynesburg University. Oh, wow. I watched a lecture. It must have been an older lecture then, huh? 21,000 autopsies, and you've supervised or signed off on how many?
About 41,000 others.
41,000. How many suicides have you come across within your career in which a combination of a highly lethal dose of heroin and a shotgun have been used in unison together?
I can't remember any such cases.
None.
No.
Wow. Okay, so this answer actually surprised me. I thought that he had once said there was a few other cases, but not many. It was very rare. Again, 21,000 autopsies he personally did himself. 41,000 he supervised or signed off on. Guess how many times heroin and a shotgun were used together to commit suicide? 0. Okay. To your knowledge, did the Seattle Police Department conduct a sufficient enough investigation at the Cobain residence before determining Kurt Cobain's death to be a suicide?
No, I do not believe they did. I think they jumped to conclusions, rushed to judgment, and they never thought that this should have been a scene that should have been thoroughly handled as a possible homicide. And that resulted in their failure to do a lot of things. You know, you approach a case like this as if it were a homicide, and then the worst that can happen is you may have spent some time unnecessarily if it proves to be a suicide. But if you start off assuming it's a suicide and you do not look for physical evidence, hair, fibers, fingerprints, footprints, piecing everything together, interrogating people and so on, then it's likely you're going to miss something. A very good analogy is the patient who comes into the emergency room and says, I got pains up in my right in my shoulder area or so on. If you just assume that it's a sprain, then you may miss a heart attack and the patient may die. You start off assuming that it might be coronary artery disease, and you check that out and make sure that you're not dealing with a coronary artery attack. And that way, you see the patients. It's a very, very good analogy to keep in mind how a case like this should have been approached.
I see. Interesting. What Dr. Wecht was telling me is very simple. Any death scene should be treated as a homicide. That way you go through the motions, you follow the guidelines, you follow protocols, you collect trace evidence. Did Seattle PD brush the room for fingerprints? No. Did they even so much as look for footprints, for hair follicles? Did they test any of the items that would have been touched by Kurt? No, they did nothing. In fact, they did not even brush the shotgun for fingerprints until 30 days later. By then, it had been handled by so many officers, there was nothing but smudge marks left. He is saying when a patient comes into the ER, they have chest pain, better treat it like it's a heart attack, better give them an EKG, because you don't want them leaving and dying later when you could have prevented their death. The same goes with any scene where a death has occurred. Go by worst case scenario, that way you don't miss anything. The Seattle PD not only missed things, they didn't even bother to look. From your experience, and I know you have a law degree as well, I'm wearing my Pittsburgh Pirates hat in honor of your alma mater. Is this a common occurrence where detectives will often just assume and go off their gut instinct, or is it usually there are protocols set in place where they would go through the motions anyway?
I would say that it is not common. At the same time, it is not rare for police to make an early assumption. They don't do it malevolently or either because, they're lazy or sloppy or so on. But just, they just look at it initially and, gee, it looks like a suicide, and maybe somebody there leads them down that path and so on, and they jump to an early conclusion. Now, the more sophisticated detectives there are, depending too on where something like this occurs. This death was in Seattle, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So not a hick town.
Not at all.
But they should have called in homicide detectives. I do not believe they did.
Remember that the Kurt Cobain case was nearly 30 years ago, and Dr. Cyril Wecht, again, 21,000 autopsies, 41,000 that he's signed or supervised. Not to mention numerous other high-profile cases. I don't know how he remembers everything he does. It's amazing. The original detectives were Steve Kirkland and Jim Yoshida. But check this out. In 2014, when in response to Soaked In Bleach, the Seattle PD decided that they would reopen and reinvestigate the case. They put Detective Chazinski on it. This is what he had to say. One of the original case detectives, Steve Kirkland, had passed away, as did the scene sergeant, Don Cameron. Steve and his partner, Jim Yoshida, were the best homicide detectives in the unit. Jim was retired, so I gave him a call and told him what I was up to. Jim told me that Courtney Love was very cooperative throughout the investigation and that they had spent a lot of time on the case. So what does that tell you, ladies and gentlemen? Guess where the best detectives got their information from? Courtney Love. Not to mention the cold case detective, Detective Chazinski, is calling the original detective, and he's depending on the original detective for his information who depended on Courtney Love. Isn't that almost like a conflict of interest? This guy is supposed to remain objective. He potentially may make Steve Kirkland and Jim Yoshida look bad for all their mess-ups. What is he doing relying on the original detective? Hey, I'm about to show all the things that you should have done and make you look really bad. He's not going to do that to a fellow detective. The first time we spoke, you had mentioned some significance surrounding the stash box, Kurt's cigar box. It actually reminded me of a detail from Marilyn Monroe's death scene where it is said several empty pill bottles were neatly lined in a row with all the lids meticulously screwed back on the top. Hardly something someone would be thinking of to do in the process of committing suicide. Could you explain to the viewers what you were talking about dealing with Kurt's stash box?
Kurt Cobain had a special stash box in which he had a syringe, one or more needles, I think some drugs, a container for a place for drugs, and some antiseptic ointment to put on the skin and so on. So what is amazing in this case is that, as I recall, Kurt Cobain then, according to the official version, injected himself and then took the time to detach the needle from the syringe, to clean it off, and to replace them back in the stash box neatly and close it up. What in the world are you going to do that? You know, you've just injected yourself. By the way, he had an amount that was high enough, if divided into 3 or 4 parts, to have killed 3 or 4 people. That much. And the effects are immediate. When you inject that kind of heroin and that dosage, the effect is immediate. You begin to lose consciousness immediately. In any event, you're not in pain or distress. You're not going to, you're relaxing. You're not going to then take the time to deal with your stash box. You're alone there, presumably under their scenario, and what do you care if somebody comes and sees the needle or whatever? So according to the official scenario, he does that, injects himself with a huge amount, and while he is in Nirvana, a state of great bliss, he takes care of his stash box. Then he takes the shotgun and shoots himself. What in the world?
Right.
That's just unbelievable. Think about it.
I want to go ahead and clean up before I do this. It doesn't make any sense. You actually went ahead and answered the next question with your description. And I'm curious, for those of us who don't work in the medical field and those of us who've never used any drugs intravenously, can you estimate how many, the amount of heroin that was found in his body from the toxicology report? Would this take more than one full syringe?
No, it would not. No, it's the concentration. It's not necessarily the total volume. It's the concentration. It depends, on the drug. And remember, heroin is not something that you buy in the drugstore that is prescribed in definitive quantitative amounts. You get a prescription for some drug, whatever it may be, 5 milligrams, 50 milligrams, whatever it is. So when you get heroin, you're buying it from some dealer off the street. You don't know who the hell put it together, so you don't know what the strength is. The strength is determined. If you were to test that material, you could determine it, or you determine it in retroactive fashion by the toxicological examination of the victim's blood.
I see. Now, we know that from the 30th of March, 1994, until the early morning hours of April 2nd, so around 36 hours, Kurt Cobain is flying to Exodus Recovery Center. He walks away. He flies home. My question for you is 36 hours of sobriety long enough to lower a person's tolerance?
No.
Okay.
Presumably he had been a user, so he had developed some tolerance. I understand that. But what I'm saying is, even with some tolerance, he wasn't a naive. This wasn't his first rodeo. But even that, the level was quite high.
Even for a heavy user.
That's right.
I see.
In 36 hours would, depending on how long he may have lived after he injected himself, then the level can go down a little bit. But with this amount that he had, I don't think he lived very long.
Okay.
I don't think he lay around a long time.
With my last question there about the syringes, I really showed how little I know about using drugs intravenously. Not necessarily a bad thing. Yes, in retrospect, kind of a dumb question. However, it got Dr. Cyril Wecht to open up a little bit and just say a little more about it. And his tone of voice and what he's saying really spoke to me. I don't think he was around long. I really don't think he would have lived very long. This is a man who knows. He would know better than anybody. He's conducted thousands of cases, lots of them suicides by deliberate overdose. He's seen this time and time again. I kind of feel like the Courtney Love backers would have us think that Kurt was superhuman, that he could take more heroin than any man that ever existed on the face of the earth. This may seem like a silly question, and I may not even use it. I was just curious for your opinion. There was a stool in the room. It seems to me it would have been easier to rest the stock of the gun on the floor and sit on the stool. And I'm thinking, if he was unconscious, if somebody else did do it, wouldn't it be easier for them to lay him out on the floor and do it? But we have no trajectory because he used birdshot shotgun shells. It did not penetrate his skull, from my understanding, so there's no hole in the ceiling, no hole in the wall. So you wouldn't be able to determine what position he was in.
Yes. Well, you see, that's the kind of thing that I was talking about earlier in terms of scene investigation. You want to get all of your photographs, all of your sketches, all of your diagrams, all of your measurements, and then, reconstruct that too in terms of what would his position most likely have been, and did that fit in with the whole scenario of using the drug and so on. That would have been important, and that wasn't done, I don't believe.
Exactly. Do you have any feelings about, just real quick about, I only have a couple more questions, about the shotgun shell landing on the wrong side of the room?
Well, there again, I can't speak definitively with a firm opinion because I don't know all of those measurements. I don't know what was observed, what was photographed, what was measured. It keeps getting back to what I'm saying. These are good questions, the answers to which should have been determined to the fullest extent possible at the scene before anything was moved, before the body was moved.
All of these things should have been done before the body was even removed. None of these things were done until, magically, 2014, the cold case detective, Detective Shazinski, magically comes up with an explanation on why the shotgun shell ended up on the wrong side of Kurt Cobain when it should have ejected on the other. Well, let me take that back. He says that he consulted with a weapons expert who explained to him the physics of how it is possible for a shell to eject the wrong way. He doesn't ever explain it. He just says, trust me, I talked to a weapons expert who, by the way, was employed by the Seattle Police Department, and he told me it's possible. That's all we got. Just 3 more questions. 2 of them come from viewers, fans of yours. One is, this might sound silly, but would it be possible even today, if all the items from the room, the root beer can, the syringes, the cigar box, the pen, whatever, is it possible to swab any of those things for DNA today? Just
well,
to see
DNA has no DNA can be tested for years after it's been around. The answer is yes. If one had all of those materials, DNA could be tested for if there were someone else's DNA prints on any of that stuff. And there again, it's a matter of what should have been done back at the time.
Right.
But the DNA, it may go away by way of decomposition, but it doesn't go away just because time passes. It doesn't diminish to the point of being absent.
Yeah, of course, and I guess it really wouldn't prove murder, but it could prove that somebody else was touching these things and using these things.
That's right.
In 2014, the Seattle Police Department reopened the Kurt Cobain case. Did they swab any of those items? Did they check for anybody else's DNA? No, they didn't. They never have. And unless somebody gets in there who really wants to solve this case, they never will. What Dr. Wecht is saying is the only way DNA could be gone is if somebody cleaned it with, say, something like bleach, or if the items were destroyed. seeing how their theory is what killed him was a combination of the drugs and the shotgun, they should have taken the whole entire stash box with them as evidence as well. Are these items sitting in an evidence locker right now, just begging for someone to come and swab them for DNA? Honestly, I can't answer that question. I don't know. They've never let us know what all they kept and what all they gave back to Courtney. I would imagine that the drugs and the syringes were destroyed along with other paraphernalia, but what about the cigar box, the pen, the spoon, the lighter, the root beer can? You have more experience than anyone who has ever walked this earth, and I've actually watched a lecture where you spoke about the history of forensic science, and it was very interesting to me that you pretty much proved it's the oldest science. Before the word science even existed, we were doing it.
That's right. Yeah.
I think 1,000 years from now, people will be reading about you like we read about Cicero, you know?
Well, that is a very gracious of you. I'm not so sure about that.
Well, I mean, there's no one else on this there's no one else on this earth that has such an extensive career as you do, and I mean, you know what I'm saying. You've been doing this since the Kennedy, since the.
Yeah, well, I certainly have a lot of experience. I would happily and graciously accept that characterization. That doesn't mean I'm always right, and it doesn't mean that there can't be other opinions. Forensic science is not an absolute science. Only in the world of forensic science, only cellular DNA is an exact absolute science. In the overall field of science, mathematics, chemistry, physics, and possibly astronomy, everything else is subject to differences of opinion and interpretation. But I express my opinions, and
very passionately, I might add.
Well, yeah. So
I
my
think that's
opinions
what
are
people
expressed.
like.
Yeah, with a reasonable degree of medical, forensic, scientific certainty or probability. That's the way I express opinions.
Absolutely. Do we have time for just two more questions?
Go ahead.
Okay. So one would be, let's see. I want to pick a good one. I want to know how you feel about lie detector tests. If you think they're reliable. As you probably already know, Dr. Edward Gelb of the FBI gave Eldon Hope 2 lie detector tests, which he supposedly passed with flying colors. I was just curious if you think those are reasonable. Should they be admissible in court or not?
Well, they are not admissible in court as a 1923 decision in the Fry case, and they are not admissible. I think that good polygraph testing by experienced, unbiased people can be helpful in trying to, narrow down some possibilities and so on. But it's not by any means an absolute science. People vary greatly in terms of how they respond emotionally, how it plays out in a physiological sense, and so on. So it can't be accepted as being completely exclusive or inculpatory. So, I think that it's a good tool for part of a overall investigation, but not certainly a major one. And since it cannot be produced in court, then obviously it is not something that anybody can rely on either side.
Okay, I understand. So another question would be, and this comes from my audience, you have extensive experience with this. I'm sure you've come across homicides and suicides. During the event of a suicide, even if, let's say it's a suicide and an investigation was conducted, a thorough investigation, and everybody's in agreement, should the occupants of a home still be interrogated, even if it is ruled a suicide? For example...
Well, they should be interrogated before it is ruled a suicide. Gets back to what I've been saying.
I'm sorry, that's what I meant.
You conduct your other people before you come to your conclusion, not afterwards. So yes, whoever was there, his wife, obviously should have been interrogated, and they would have found out. I don't know the details, but I think that things were not real smooth and comfortable and happy between him and Courtney Love.
Absolutely.
And in fact, I think they talked about getting a divorce and so on. So obviously that would have been very relevant, very relevant.
Yes, and there were two house guests, Jessica Hopper and Callie
Yeah.
DeWitt, who left one day before his body was discovered. My last question, you're probably going to laugh at me, but I was told to ask, and I know you're probably not going to answer it. Do you believe Courtney Love had something to do with this? Hold up. Now, before you get the full answer, I want you to know that Dr. Cyril Wecht has been asked this question before, numerous times, and he has never truly answered it. He has always deflected the question. He has always said a very reasonable response. I am not a homicide detective. I do not determine who. I determine what, when, how, where, all that stuff. He has never really given his feelings, but here he opens up.
I believe there is a possibility, but I can't say that with reasonable medical certainty because I don't have anything of a definitive nature. It gets back to what I've been talking about. She certainly would have been, as they say in the criminal field, a person of interest. At that point, person of interest, and she should have been privately and extensively interrogated before a ruling was made.
Wow. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
I think it's a possibility. She should have been a prime person of interest. She should have been interrogated extensively, but the Seattle PD did not do their job.